Hiya, just for those that don't know me, everybody seems to. My name's Tam Kirby. I've been in the Communist Party for 3 years now. I'm in a band, I'm in a rock band. I've toured this thing more than I have my rock band in the last 6 months, honestly. I've done more gigs with this than I have with that. And the band's a lot better, honestly. I did this in Fife as part of the Morning Star, our class, our culture thing. And me and John Foster had spoke about, because we were going to do some stupid thing about the ragged trouser philanthropist or something. I said, well, no. I said, it's 2014 and all we're hearing at the moment is a rewriting of the history of the World War I. Because you've got Dan Snow, the supposed famous historian, on telling us that, you know, the generals weren't all bad, and it was really it was a war that Britain had to go to, and it was, you know, it was to defeat these Germans who were all aggression and what have you. And I actually thought, well, that's the biggest load of bullshit I've ever heard in my life, being a wee man for Blingerine 5. So I come up with this one, and I learned loads when I was actually sort of going through this and pulling things together, pulling pictures, and I actually learnt more than I knew. I mean, I did O-level history at school, that was it. I done O-level history in 1978 and I got a C, so I wasn't even that good. And we did an entire year on World War I. Our last year, the entire year was on World War I. And everything I'm going to say here, apart from a couple of things, wasn't even in the O-level that I did. And I don't think that it's even in the O-levels or standard grades or the hires that they actually do now. And a lot of the things that I discovered I was quite shocked with. So I'll start with this one, which I think is a great thing. A bayonet is a weapon with a worker at each end. Never a truer word could be spoken. Because, and I'm not going to go on about, well, not too much, I'm not going to go on about the Battle of the Somme and Flanders and all this, but what I will do, and you can't really see that, right?
Is that a bit out of focus or something?
No, it's just because it's not focusing properly. But what I'll do, no, just leave it. It'll not make any difference. But I'll give you the numbers that are there, because that's just a wee spreadsheet. In effect, there was 64 million men mobilised in the First World War. 9.5 million of them died. Now that's all camps, because what I've got there is Russia, France, Germany. 9.5 million men died. 21 million were wounded. 8 million disappeared, missing. So the total casualties were 38 million. 38 million, which was that's almost 60% of the total men mobilised. 60% of them were either died, wounded, or went missing, as they call it. Now, these numbers, when I was researching this, there was actually numbers. It could actually go up as high as there's some sites will give you. There was 20 million people died. I took a middle road. I took the sort of the middle line. So that's the average of what the people that actually talk about World War I, what they say. At the end of the day, 9.5 million men dying. For what? And that's the purpose of this, what I'm doing here. And you can't see it. Anyway, that's supposed to be a picture. That's a picture for the funeral of Edward VII in 1910. And that's actually a picture of the Crown Heads of State. There were over 50 heads of state turned up for his funeral. That's princes, princesses, kings, queens, emperors, tsars, you name it. Every single one of them was related in some way, either through marriage, through birth. Right? Every single one of those 50. And the ones in the picture are from Norway, Bulgaria, Portugal, Germany, Greece, Belgium, Spain, Denmark. So you've got a son-in-law, a second cousin, a nephew, a brother-in-law, second cousin, nephew, brother-in-law. So that was our king in 1910. There's the three. Can you see it? That's the three protagonists. Nicholas II here, that's him here. That's Nicky, good old Nicky in Russia. There's Willie. And there's George, that's yours. So these are the three main protagonists, or the three main countries that went to war. And what are they? Cousins. Every single one of them directly related through good old Queen Vic. Now, obviously in Britain was slightly different from Russia and Germany, because in Russia the Tsar ruled, and he ruled, he made the decisions. It's the same in Germany. In Britain our monarchy was curtailed by Parliament, but it still doesn't matter. The three main countries that were at war were still directly related. That's a picture of Tsar Nicholas and Prince George, your Prince George, and the two of them are wearing German uniforms. Trust me, the two of them are wearing dressed German uniforms. This is before the war, obviously, because they were cousins, they were friends, they were family. So, the run up to the war, and I'm not going to go into huge detail because there's a whole host of things that you could talk about in the run up to the war. But in effect, on one side you had the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria, Hungary and Italy. On the other side, you had Russia and France had created their own alliance. Then in 1907, Britain joined. Who did they join with? They joined with Russia and France. Right? So, which was called the Triple Entente. And these alliances were there supposedly to protect each other. So that if one country attacked another, well, these other two countries will jump in and try and prevent it. And it's the old one, the old adage that, you know, this is there to prevent war. We're going to stop anything from happening. But in effect, what they were doing is they were actually creating the whole impetus to actually start a war and start creating it. The thing with Italy was, Italy actually joined with Germany and Austria-Hungary. But unbeknown to Germany and Austria-Hungary, Italy made a wee agreement with France in secret to say, by the way, we're not having none of it and the Germans can piss off. You know? So if you go to war, we're out of it. So in reality, by 1914, Italy was not actually part of the war. And Italy didn't even enter the war until 1915, and we'll come to that in a wee bit. So basically, although Germany thought they had two dependable allies sort of on their southern borders, in Austria-Hungary and Italy, they actually only had one. So they were then surrounded. Right? The run up to it, right from 1870 right up to 1914, Germany and Britain were in an arms race. You heard that one before. I grew up in the 70s and then sort of was a teenager in the 80s. And all I heard about was the arms race between Russia or the Soviet Union, America and Britain. And what was it? At that time it was nuclear weapons, and we all had to build more and more nuclear weapons because Russia has. But exactly the same was happening in Europe. Germany was actually creating more ships than Britain, because at that time Britain protected its entire empire through its navy. So Germany actually spent millions and millions of Deutschmarks to actually increase its navy. Over that period up to 1913, the German navy actually increased its tonnage. They talk about shipping and tonnage. 1870 it had 88,000 tons of shipping. In 1913, 1914 it had 964,000 tons. Well, which is phenomenal. So both sides, both Britain and Germany were actually, they were in an arms race. The Germans and the French actually had conscription during this time as well. Their armies actually doubled in size between that period. So they were actually mobilising people. Britain had actually held back for that. but Britain was still investing in its navy because Britain saw what was happening in Germany and they wanted to protect the empire, and that was done by the navies. Like I said, in the 1980s it was done through, what was the name of the one, Polaris? Was it Polaris? Nuclear weapons, and other ones, or cruise missiles was the other one. Well, in those days it was actually battleships, so they were actually, Germany and France were actively increasing their armies, increasing their navies. So other things between that time, Britain and Japan signed an alliance. So there we go, Britain and Japan signing an alliance. In 1905, Germany devised a plan to invade France. They devised a plan in 1905 to invade France through Belgium, who was neutral. And strangely enough, Hitler did exactly the same bloody thing in World War II. Then we have the whole thing where Austria-Hungary actually annexes parts of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And what this did was actually inflame the Serbian nation, because at that time, just like it is now, that whole part which used to be Yugoslavia when I was growing up was actually a separate state, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and you've heard all these names now because again it turned into carnage not that long ago. So in 1912 there was actually a war in the Balkans between Austria-Hungary, Serbia, Bulgaria and Greece, and basically they moved in to fight the Turks, to actually move the Turks out of that whole area. And by 1913 they'd actually driven the Turks out of the Balkans, because the Turks had actually been in there. The Ottoman Empire actually had spread that far. So there was actually a wee mini war, if you like, 1913. But peace came, but then Bulgaria wanted more, so Bulgaria attacked Greece and Serbia. Romania attacked Bulgaria, and then there was a second Balkan war. And this is before the war. This is before Franz Ferdinand was shot. You know? So we get to 1914, and I mean, I think you do know, Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne, is shot. The Austrians blamed the Serbs. They said it was a Serb uprising, Serb anarchists, I think they called them. You know? So Austria-Hungary started mobilising. Britain tries to quell things, speaks to Germany, speaks to France. France and Italy and Russia try to get into the talks. Germany disagrees. Austria-Hungary then declares war on Serbia. So what do we have then? We have Russia is now sabre rattling, and Russia actually starts to mobilise because Russia has an alliance with Serbia. So Russia mobilises. Germany starts to then mobilise. The strange thing is, what you can find telegrams that between the Tsar and the Kaiser right up to the eve of them both declaring war on each other, and they're both sending telegrams to each other, and the telegrams go, "Dear Nicky, please stop mobilising your troops, because if you mobilise your troops, I will start mobilising." And then, "Dear Willie, unless Austria-Hungary retreats from Serbia, we will continue to mobilise." And this is how they're talking to each other, you know, it's like, "Willie, you're going to do that? Nicky, piss off, you tell your mates." And they were actually on friendly terms, and these telegrams were back and forward, right up until, bang, Germany declares war on Russia. So Germany declares war on Russia. France starts to mobilise, because France has an alliance with Russia. So, what does Germany do? Invades France through Belgium, which is neutral. This is the British in, because Britain then says, to protect neutral Belgium, they send an ultimatum to Germany to say, you need to withdraw from Belgium. Germany gives it, we're no listening. Britain declares war on Germany. As soon as Britain declares war on Germany, so does Australia, New Zealand, India, Canada. South Africa. So it wasn't just Britain declaring war, it was the entire British Empire was declaring war. So, August 8, 1914, Britain enacts the Defence of the Realm Act, which in effect gives full powers to the government. Full powers over everything. Full powers over manufacturing, over the army, everything. And you could go on about the battles that happened, because there were battles back and forward in 1914, but at the end of the day, what none of them expected and what none of them were prepared for was modern armies and the way modern armies were going to fight in those days. And just telling 10,000 men to run at a machine gun doesn't work. And by the end of 1914, there was basically two lines of trenches for the Swiss border right to the English Channel. Germans on one side, French and British on the other, and it was a stalemate. And just, it's no part of this, the run up to Christmas, everybody knows what happened at Christmas in 1914, Christmas Day. The soldiers, the actual soldiers, called a truce, met each other, no man's land, had a wee party, swapped cigarettes, swapped drink, and had a couple of days of non-violence. This was frowned upon from those on high, and both sets of troops were told in non-certain terms, this will never be allowed to happen again, or else. You can't fight a war if you're friendly with the people, you know. And I go back to the first one, you know, a bayonet is a weapon, we'll work at either, because that's what it was. German, Austrian workers there, British, French workers on this side. And at Christmas they had a wee truce. But that was frowned upon and were told, no way. So, jump into 1915, and just a few highlights. In January 1915, the Germans used poison gas on the Russians on the Eastern Front for the first time. So that's the first time, really, that poison gas was used. April 1915, Germany uses poison gas on the French, on the Western Front. April 1915, Allied troops land in Gallipoli, and I'm going to come back to that because that's the main reason they're doing it, I want to go on about this. And then 1915, a German U-boat sinks in Lusitania, 128 Americans are killed. America starts sabre rattle in 1915. Now, May 1915, Italy enters a war on the Allied side, and we'll come to that again. May 1915, Germany bombs London. Germany bombs London. Now that was a new thing, because one thing that is missing for the statistics is what they call collateral damage. You all know what collateral damage is, eh? That's human beings that are dead, killed in war. In World War I, there are estimates for civilians, and it's anywhere between 8 and 16 million civilians died in World War. That's over and above the 9.5 million I say. These are civilians, and they died either through having bombs dropped on them, starvation, disease, and being actually moved out of their homes. Somewhere between 8 and 16 million. So if you take the middle point again, you know, if you take 11 million, 11, 12 million, and add it onto the 9.5 million, it's unthinkable. In Africa, Germany loses one of its colonies, which is now Namibia. Germany actually had started, the only place Germany could get an empire or gain land was in Africa, because the French and the British had freaking stolen everything, you know. I mean, Britain actually owned a quarter of the world. France owned huge swathes of the world, and Germany had nowhere to go. So Germany was actually moving into Africa, just as were the French and as were the British. So there was actually fighting going on in Africa as well. And in 1915, Germany actually lost one of its colonies. In 1915, Bulgaria enters a war on the German side, because they hate the Serbs. They hate the Serbs, and that's what they're doing it for. They want Serbia as part of their empire. September 1915, Britain uses poison gas for the first time. So the carnage goes on. And I just want to go back to, you can't see it, no, to Gallipoli and the Gallipoli campaign. For centuries, Russia had been trying to gain possession or try to take Constantinople. They'd been trying for centuries. And for decades, Britain had been stopping them from getting it. Britain actually went to war. The Crimean War was fought pure and simply to stop Russia from gaining Constantinople and the freedom of the Straits there. And that's why they did that. But because Turkey was on the German side, Britain decided that it was going to attack the Turks in Gallipoli, or via Gallipoli. And a famous man, Mr. Winston Churchill, you all heard of him, eh? He was the Admiral of the Navy. Actually, he came up with a plan of actually attacking Turkey via Gallipoli. And he called it the weak underbelly of those who fought against the Allies. And he used the exact same terminology in World War II to convince the Americans to invade fucking Italy. And he used that exact same term, the weak underbelly of the Nazis. Right? The World War II one went a wee bit better, but it was close to being carnage. Gallipoli was actually one of the greatest disasters that the Allies had. Now, if you're ever in Australia, or if you ever meet an Australian, they have Anzac Day every year. And I was actually in Australia one year and on Anzac Day, and it's brilliant. You're allowed to gamble freely in the pubs and the clubs. They do, tossing the coins. It's illegal on every other day except for Anzac Day, because the Australians and New Zealanders have they've stolen Gallipoli as their war. To hear them, you would think it was only Australians and New Zealanders that died at Gallipoli, but it wasn't. There were thousands and thousands of actual British people died in Gallipoli as well. But basically, just a wee quote for a British soldier after, because Gallipoli only went from April 1915 to January 1916, and one British soldier said, "It looked like a midden and smelt like an open cemetery." 480,000 Allied forces took part in the Gallipoli campaign. 480,000. More than half of them ended up casualties. 46,000 of them died. And then on the Turkish side, you're talking about another 250,000 casualties. And nobody really knows how many died, but it could be as much as 65,000 died. So that's 500,000. Basically, you're 500,000 casualties attacking the weak underbelly of the Triple Alliance. It was a complete and utter disaster. But why was it? And you'll not be able to see this, but here we go. See that there? You've seen this. That's a secret treaty. This is a treaty between Britain and Russia. And this was signed on March the 12th, 1915, prior to the Gallipoli campaign. And it's basically telling Russia will get the Straits and Constantinople in return for a similar benevolent attitude on Russia's part towards the political aspirations of Britain and other parts, i.e. Persia or Arabia, or what is now Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. So in effect, Britain and Russia had a wee agreement going with them. Nobody knew about it. Nobody knew about it. That Russia, you get Constantinople, you get this, you get that, but by the way, we're getting all that, so you steer clear. And everybody was happy, and they signed the deal. Nobody knew about this. There were actual rumours in 1915 about this particular treaty. And some MPs actually asked questions in the House of Parliament. And they were told, oh no, none like that exists. No. You know where this came from? This came after the Russian Revolution in 1917. The Bolshevik government It was actually Leon Trotsky actually discovered all these secret treaties, and there's more. I'm going to talk about more, and sent them to the Guardian in Manchester, and they were published. And that's the only reason anybody in this country or the world actually found out about these treaties, because that's what was happening. That's why they invaded Constantinople. That's why they invaded Gallipoli. It had nothing to do with weak underbellies. It was to do with this agreement that the Russians are going to get that bit of Turkey, that Britain is getting the whole Arabian Peninsula beneath them. That's what they agreed. That's what they signed up to. Here's the other one. You know, as I said, in 1915, Italy joined. Who did they join? They joined on the Allied side because, strangely enough, in April the 26th, 1915, Italy signed another secret agreement with Britain and France to say, basically, if you join in on our side, once we've won and beat the Germans and Austro-Hungarians, you can have all this here. They were basically giving Italy the entire southern part of Austria-Hungary. That was going to be their spoils. That was how they could then increase their empire. There was also another one where they could actually, they were given parts of Albania. They were given parts of Serbia, and they were also given some parts of Northern Africa. Secret agreement. That's why Italy came in. Italy didn't come in because they hated the Germans, or because the Germans were going to invade them. Italy came in because they were going to be able to increase their empire, because we've got the agreement, because we're going to win. And once we've won, we're going to get that. Nobody knew about that. The Bolshevik government sent that to the Manchester Guardian. So, by the end of 1915, now bearing in mind, the beginning of 1915, the governments of France, Britain, Russia and Italy are sitting, divvying up Europe and Arabia and Turkey. They're sitting there, across tables, drinking coffee, drinking champagne, and they're divvying up country by country. And by the end of 1915, the British Army had lost 528,227 men. So while they're sitting there divvying up the land, more than 500,000 British soldiers are either dead, wounded or missing by the end of 1915. And what was happening then was there wasn't enough people, no enough cannon fodder, no enough troops in the trenches to send over. So, starting in 1916, they introduced Military Service Act, or conscription. So now, Britain went from having an army of volunteers to anybody that is under the age of 46 and unmarried is now going to be called up and must go to war, must go to the trenches. They did have a wee clause, they put in a conscientious clause, because there were conscientious objectors. Yeah? And they would be either through religion, like Quakers and Jehovah's Witnesses, communists and socialists. Real communists and socialists were conscientious objectors and objected to the war, and we'll come to that in a wee bit as well. And you had pacifists, and there was actually a campaign, and the likes of Willie Gallagher and John McLean up here were all part of the campaign against conscription, and were fighting against conscription. They were actually fighting against the war, and we'll come to that a wee bit later as well. But there was, throughout the country, throughout Britain, there was a movement. There wasn't a very big movement. It was small, but there was a movement of conscientious objectors trying to organise and try to mobilise people. But the thing you've got to understand is, the first couple of years of the war, the British, in reality, the bulk of the British working class, the bulk of the trade unions actually supported the war. And were all gung-ho. I mean, in 1914 they all went off and they were convinced they were coming back for Christmas. But even 1915, they were still pretty They were still pretty gung-ho and behind the government and behind the war. But there were conscientious objectors. You'll notice, I don't know if you could see that. These were some of the propaganda that was put out about conscientious objectors. That's a man getting a bayonet stabbed in his arse there. And this, I don't know, you maybe see it better. You know, saying, it'd be better if you come in here and see it there. But you can see there how they're depicting conscientious objectors. Depicting them as effeminate. You know? Depicting them as women. And they're showing them to say, look, you're not a man. You can't be a man if you're going to want to go and fight for king and country. If you don't want, you know, you're not prepared to die, you're not a man. That's the reality. You can see them there. No effeminate men there. They're all conscientious objectors. Because everybody, some conscientious objectors actually went to war and would work in the medical services. They wouldn't fight, but they would work in medical services. Right? Those that didn't want to fight, didn't want to take any part in the war, were put in jail. They were actually given hard labour. That bottom one there, that's hard labour. They're there breaking up rocks. They were treated badly, they were starved and they were abused, the conscientious objectors that were actually jailed. Right? And they weren't effeminate. They were actually, in the main, men that were standing up for their principles. In the main, they would be socialists or communists. And they didn't agree with the war. They didn't agree with going and killing workers just because your king and your country tells you to. So that was, at least there was a fight back, and as the war progressed, it actually increased and increased. The other thing, of course, that happened was women. That's all women, because women all of a sudden, all the men are now in the trenches or in the navy or wherever. So they had women actually joining it, and I did this picture because that shows you them as not just as nurses, but they were actually, like say, in the Air Force. They were lorry drivers, they drove ambulances, they did everything, women. So they conscripted a whole load of women into the armed forces as well, that actually went across to France to fight. And then obviously into the factories. So it was getting on for 2 million women were actually moved from domestic duties, if you like, or what would be called domestic duties, and actually either into the army in some form, or actually into munition factories like these women. It was getting on for 1 million women were actually employed in the munition factories throughout Britain between 1914 and 1918. And to be honest, it was actually, women actually seen it as a liberating experience. Because up until that point, they were, especially working class women, they were either maids or they were married. And, you know, they had very poor prospects of actually doing anything. And they actually seen this as actually being liberating. They were actually out there earning good money. They were seeing themselves as helping the war effort. And obviously, it gave them a liberating experience, and a certain amount of freedom that they'd never had before. So, and then of course the good outcome from this, because during this time, up to that time, you had the suffragette movement, because women couldn't vote, women didn't have the vote at this point. But at least after the war, in 1918, women were given the war. But women over 30 years old got the vote. But only if they were a member or married to a member of the local government register, a property owner, or a graduate voting in a university constituency. So that was something I didn't know. I thought in 1918 women got the vote. Yeah, only a certain amount of women got the vote. Only those over 30, and only those that fell into that scope. And to be fair, some men didn't even have the vote either in 1918. You know, total universal suffrage didn't happen for another decade. But women, everybody thinks that women got the vote in 1918. Well, only some women got the vote in 1918. And I heard John Foster actually came up with a good one. He said, you see, do you know why it was only women over 30 years that got the vote? And it's true what he said. He said, if you think of it, who was working in the factories? Young, working class women. And what would their politics likely be? Kind of leaning left, socialist. So, and yet the older ones that weren't working in the factories and the ones that did get the vote there would tend to be, you know, property owners, middle class, a wee bit older. They would be kind of right leaning. And I thought, you know, so I'd never thought about that until John actually pointed it out. And I thought, it's spot on. You know, if you think about it, actually good. And then I've got a picture of you can name me, Willie Gallagher, Mary Barber and John McLean. Because there were people organising against it. Some of the trade unions started to fight back, and especially against the defence of the Rail Mart, because what it meant, like say, in Glasgow, and one of the big sticking points in Glasgow was that a working man could not leave his job. No matter what, he wasn't allowed to leave his job without permission. Right? So that was one of the things. They actually seen their wages being driven down, their terms and conditions were starting to get driven down as well, because they were bringing people in from outside, and it was actually driving down the terms and conditions, and they weren't allowed to leave. So in Glasgow you had the Clyde Workers Committee, which was formed, and they had strikes, and you had Willie Gallagher and you had John McLean, and they were actually fighting against it. John McLean was jailed for his anti-war activism. He was actually jailed for sedition. Willie Gallagher was arrested under the defence of the Rail Mart again and jailed for their activities. I've got a good one here. In 1916, the shop stewards in the Clyde shipyards were arrested and put on trial, and their punishment, I found this amazing, they were exiled to Edinburgh. And I thought, that must be some punishment for a wee J. Exiling them to is it a punishment? I thought, my God, maybe they were trying to educate them. Exile to Edinburgh, you know. The Tsar used to exile his ones to friggin' Siberia, you know, or shoot them. The shop stewards in Glasgow, they got a wee holiday in Edinburgh. Mental. The other one, I mean, during the strikes, because there were strikes in the Glasgow shipyard, and not just in Glasgow, in Liverpool, London as well. You know, there were people active throughout the country. But Lloyd George, who was the then Prime Minister, referred to the union leaders as idle drunkards, and in reality, they were all teetotal. But as I say, they were all arrested at some point for sedition. The other thing that of course happened in Glasgow and then kind of spread was the Mary Barber thing and the rent strikes, because not only was the housing inadequate even before the war, right? The housing was terrible in Glasgow before the war, but because of the war and because of bringing all these people in, it became worse. But it became the typical capitalist way, you know, supply and demand. Too much demand, not enough supply. So what they started doing was they started evicting the people that had lived in the houses for years, so they could get in people in that had come from outside to work in the shipyards, who would pay higher rent. So the private landlords kept bumping up the rents, and then you had Mary Barber, who started the Mary Barber's Army, who you've all heard then. I'm not going, so I didn't need to go on about that one. But that had to be done. It had to stop. the thing I do like about it is, by November 1915, 20,000 households in Glasgow were on rent strip. 20,000. That's some organised. Yeah. You think about it. You think the STUC does a march, and if you were to get 20,000 on an STUC march, would really put the flags out. 20,000. And it actually worked, because they actually gained something. The Trades Council got involved, the unions got involved, because they seen what was happening. They seen what was happening to the women, they seen it for what it was. It was the privateers making profit for people's misery, and they weren't caring. So it had to happen. So these things were happening. And just to prove it wasn't just here. I've got one here for the Fife Bakers Union. That's a telegram from the Dunfermline, Cowdenbeath and Kelty district. Fife Bakers and Confectioners Union. Right? And it's to the Minister of Labour. That one there. Right? That one there, to the Minister of Labour, who at that time was Mr. Asquith, who used to be the Prime Minister, but got kicked out. Basically saying that in Fife, the only things we had in Fife at that time were mines and Rosyth Dockyard. And it just so happened at that particular time, Rosyth Dockyard was full of British naval ships. And the pits were working flat out. And the bakers, their terms and conditions were getting hit, their wages were getting hit, so they went on strike. And they basically sent a telegram to Mr. Asquith saying, the miners ain't going to get any bread, and neither is your mate in Rosyth Dockyard, unless you agree to our terms. Right? And it was chaos. Mr. Asquith jumped on a train and turned up in Fife the very next day and sorted it out, and the bakers got their way. They got their terms and conditions sorted, they got their money. So it wasn't just Glasgow. That's why I put that one in. It wasn't just Glasgow that things were happening. It was happening throughout the country. I just want to jump. 1916 was called. I don't know how you could read that. They actually called 1916 the bloodletting. And we'll get to that. But some other things. And what happened at the start of 1916, Germany lost more colonies in Africa, so there's still fighting going on in Africa. Romania declares war on Germany and Austria-Hungary, and we'll come back to that one. Germany's entire economy is placed under what's called the Hindenburg Plan, which in effect was dictatorship. The army was now in control of everything that was happening in Germany. November 1918. The Battle of the Somme ends. Now, everybody's heard the Battle of the Somme, and I'm not going to go through all the first day. You know, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, 60,000 people were killed. At the end of the Battle of the Somme, 600,000 men were either dead, wounded or missing. 600,000 men in one battle. And in 1916, I mentioned Lloyd George. Lloyd George became Britain's new Prime Minister. And what he actually, his first statement was, his new cabinet immediately begins to organise the country for total war. You know, I don't know. 600,000 men dead, dying, injured. If that's no total war, I don't know what is. I honestly don't know what is. So, what did happen in 1916 in reality was France was going to mobilise on the Western Front. They'd actually struck a deal with Russia that Russia would actually do an offensive on the Eastern Front at the same time. Britain also agreed, and that's where you ended up with a major battle on the Eastern Front. You ended up with the Battle of Verdun and the Battle of the Somme on the Western Front. And just one statistic that caught me on for the Eastern Front and the Russians. At the start of this offensive, over a 10-day period, the Russians were actually losing 10,000 men a day. That was dead. 10,000 men per day dead on the Eastern Front. And what else was happening? Food shortages, fuel shortages. 1916 at this time, Britain's debt was spiralling out of control. And who did we owe the money to? Good old US of A. Because somebody has to pay for it, somebody has to make money out of it. What else happens in 1916? Bloody Irish, eh? Got the Easter Uprising in Ireland as well. So there's more British troops sent over there to sort that out under his prepare for total war. So, during 1916, all this bloodletting and death, here's another secret treaty, signed in spring 1916, agreed in 1916. Agreement between Britain, France and Russia to the zones of influence and acquisitions, territorial acquisitions, in Turkey. Basically, Britain to obtain southern Mesopotamia with Baghdad, Syria, France gets a bit of Syria. Palestine to be subject to a special regime. Therein lies the entire chaos that is happening in Palestine at the moment. Here's the start. A secret treaty between France, Russia and Germany. Shocking. 1916, Russia are losing 10,000 men a day. Dying. But they've still got time to sign a secret agreement with Japan over China. Because they too are wanting to divvy up China. I said Russia. And you all know the chaos that in reality that was happening in Russia in 1916. But the Tsar and his government are doing a secret treaty with Russia. And I come back to Romania because Romania jumped in with us. So Romania is to get Transylvania and the River Fees and Bukovina and up to the River Pruth and all this. So this is another agreement between Britain, France and Romania. And the thing that got me was when I seen who was married to the King of Romania or the Emperor of Romania. Princess Maria of Edinburgh was married to the King of Romania. Princess Maria, another relative of ours. And by all accounts, she actually wore the trousers. So she made the decisions and she decided what was happening, and she decided in reality that we are going in with the British and the French. 1916, another secret agreement. I become dumbfounded. So, the run up to the end of 1916, and by 1917, if we go down to what was Arabia or Persia, as it was called, the whole Arab world, this amazed me, this one. By 1917, the British had made 3 different agreements with 3 different groups, promising 3 different political futures for the Arab world. The French and the British in reality knew what they wanted. They were just going to divide it up, and that's what they did. They actually just drew a couple of lines on a map and said, well, that's yours, that's mine, that's mine. And what they did do was they dropped in wee puppet leaders. They actually had Arab leaders, but they were puppets and they were controlled by Britain in reality. And again, I'll go back. The whole conflict that's happening now in Syria, Iraq, Palestine, that whole conflict goes back to these secret agreements between France Russia and Britain. The whole thing. So in 1917, the United States not only, it's obviously not made enough money for the British. It's actually it severs its ties, diplomatic ties with Germany. We'll come back to the Russia in a bit. By April, America declares war on Germany. Now think on this. What's happening in Russia at the time? 1917. Russia is in turmoil. It's in chaos. There's a revolution. There's revolution starting. And all of a sudden America decides it needs to join the war. And I always smell a rat. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, honestly, I'm not. But I smell a rat here. And there's a few things further on that makes me smell that. Because in March the 15th, 1917, good old Nicky does a decent thing and gives up and says, I'm abdicating. And then April, within weeks, America has declared war on Germany. So, what's happening in Russia? The provisional government in Russia, that Britain, France and America all rushed to say, oh, we support you, we'll support you, please stay in the war, we'll support you. Because that's exactly what they did. And they did stay in the war. But what was happening? The Bolshevik party actually had a huge upsurge at that time. Between May, the last week in May, first week of June, on the Western Front, the French army, or huge portions of the French army actually mutiny. They go on strike. They refuse to go over the top. They refuse. They've had enough. The French soldiers have had enough. They have seen the futility of it. So they go on strike. It's called a mutiny. There was actually more than half of the divisions refused to move and refused to attack. So there's a new commander-in-chief put in, Henry Pétain, is put in charge of the French. And what does he do about this mutiny? He goes out, orders mass arrests, and arbitrarily just actually picks people. I say, just pick them. Every third, every fourth person. And they shot them. Shot them for being cowards. The French had enough, that they shot them. After the executions, after this murder, you know what Mr. Pétain or Monsieur Pétain decides to do then? He actually stops every single planned French offensive in 1917 because he knew it was out of control. So he murdered these people and then actually concedes to what they're wanting, which is not to be used as cannon fodder. And he actually runs round the entire French trenches personally, trying to boost morale. So he takes them, murders people for no reason, and then gives them what they want, because the French did not mount an offensive again in 1917, because Pétain knew it wouldn't have happened. Germany still bombing London. New Britain starts bombing Germany. I didn't know that. I knew Germany had bombed London, you know, with their Zeppelins and what have you. But I didn't know that Britain had actually bombed Germany during the First World War, but they did. Now in July the 6th, 1917, Greece declares war on Germany. Now we've got somebody else in. Here's another one. Now just bear in mind what's happening in Russia in 1917. And here's in February 1917. Redrawn the frontiers of Germany and a secret agreement between France and Russia. Russia's in turmoil. Their troops have been slaughtered. They've got revolutions spreading, and still the Tsar and the government are still negotiating how they're going to divvy up basically Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Unbelievable. And then obviously we get the October Revolution, we get the Great Revolution, and the Bolsheviks take power in Russia. And what do? That's it, we're not fighting. We've had enough. We ain't fighting, which was great. That to me is why America joined the war. What's the first thing Britain does on this? Once the actual civil war breaks out, what does Britain do? It sends troops to Russia. Britain sent troops to Russia to fight with the Mensheviks, if you like. Britain. It's carnage on the Western Front, got millions of people dying, but still it's seen this must be put down first. And it sent troops to Russia. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. So, we'll jump on to 19, we're almost there, honestly. 1918. The thing that inspired me about 1918 in Britain was the May Day. There was still May Day demonstrations by the trades councils, by the trade unions. I think in Glasgow, the May Day rally in Glasgow was 100,000 people in 1918. And they were calling for an end to the war. They were calling for peace, and they were calling for an end to the war on the May Day rally. 100,000 people. There was almost the same amount in Liverpool, Birmingham. The London one was banned. The government banned the May Day rally in London because it was going to be, they were expecting something like 500,000 people to be marching through the streets because the trade unions had had enough. They were calling for a ban. Because in 1918, ration books were introduced. In August, 1,000 Liverpool policemen went on strike. In Britain, the police went on strike. 20,000 London policemen went on strike. London policemen went on strike. Unbelievable. You know why they went on strike? Increased pay and union recognition. Yeah. Mental. And then of course the war ends. And you could do a whole talk on how the war ended, why it ended. I have a sneaky feeling. The First World War just ended. It just went. Because what was happening in Germany, and Russia there was a revolution, and the British sent troops there to try and help squash the revolution. And in Germany at the same time, in 1918, there was mass unrest in Germany. The German Navy went on strike. It refused to sail. There were mass strikes right throughout the entire German country. And it was that close to a communist revolution. That close. And then all of a sudden, everybody decided we're going to stop the war, just like that. And this is only me, and it's only my thoughts. I've not read it anywhere. But I think they were too afraid of what had happened in Russia, and they seen it was going to happen in Germany, and they decided this is to stop. We have to stop this from spreading now, and we're going to stop it here. Because what happened then in Germany was all the soldiers that actually went back into Germany, it was them that put down the revolution. It was actually the commanders, the generals, the captains, the colonels, and some right-wingers that actually put down the revolution that was actually happening in Germany at the time. It was put down by the German army. And I'm still convinced the war was stopped for that reason. And because there was no clear win, there was no decisive battle that said, yep, that's it, Germany's beat. Germany was still capable of actually fighting. But then you could take from what happened in Versailles and the treaty and the way they actually divided up Germany and the way they treated Germany, and they made them pay for everything, that it just naturally led on to fascism, Hitler, Mussolini first, then Hitler, and then the Second World War. It It was almost as if it had been written, and I'm convinced it was pure and simply to prevent communism from spreading any further. That's my opinion only. No facts to bear it up. What else is happening in 1918? Your man, John McLean, again. He's already been in jail for sedition. He's out and he's back up in jail. And you all know his famous, statement. I like this one though. I just like this bit out there. I consider capitalism the most infamous, bloody, evil system that mankind has ever witnessed. And I think that kind of summed up that 4-year period. Because somebody was making money out of it. And it certainly wasn't the workers. Somebody was definitely making money, and it wasn't the workers. And there was loads of people, millions of people were dying. And yes, you'll hear on the telly that privately educated people died. Yes, they did. Yep, definitely. But no millions, not millions. The millions that died were workers. So we have people getting jailed again, Mr. McLean getting jailed again. And what else? So they come back for the war, all these soldiers, and they come back to no work. If they've got work, the wages are cut, the terms and conditions are cut. Because somebody has to pay for the war, because Britain is in billions of pounds worth of debt. It all went through from 1915 right through into 1918. Through borrowing money for America and the good old quantitative easing, because they did quantitative easing during the First World War as well. You've heard that, eh? We bailed out the banks with it. Well, they did it during the war. So who had to pay for it? Who has to pay for it? I'm afraid it has to be the workers. Here's a wee one there, that you can't see it right there, it's there. I got that. That's a picture of a handout, right, from 100 years ago. What they're asking for? A living wage. 100 years ago. That's for a living wage, shorter working week and trade union rights. 100 years ago. Not much has changed there. This one. You can see it. Glasgow Trades Council. Glasgow Union. A call to arms. Strike. This was actually 1919. Friday the 31st of January 1919. Called it Bloody Friday. 40,000 Glasgow workers came out and strike on Monday. 70,000 the following day. Friday, there was somewhere between 60 and 100,000 people in George Square. And I got the picture. There you go. A big red flag right in the middle. Brilliant. And why? Because the war's over, and it's the working man that has to pay for it. It's the working class that's paying for it. Because your wages are getting cut, you're going to have to work more hours, and you're just going to have to knuckle down. Now, wasn't it just, I'm picking on Glasgow, there were mass demonstrations throughout the country in 1919, honestly. I'm picking on Glasgow because we all know it. This is what the Prime Minister said about what was happening in Glasgow. It's a misnomer to call the situation in Glasgow a strike. This is a Bolshevik uprising. Just because of 100,000 people in George Square, and what did they do? I'm going backwards. What did they do? Set up tanks. They set up English soldiers. That's a picture of 3 of the tanks actually in the salt market in Glasgow. The tanks. They actually had howitzers and machine gun posts dotted throughout central Glasgow, armed by English soldiers, because it was they feared it was a Bolshevik uprising. Honestly, it's the truth. It's the truth. I'm not telling lies. There's a tank going through the town. And then what happened to the strike leaders after the army had its way? Again, the usual suspects. I keep picking on Willie Gallagher because he's he come to Fife and he was your MP. They arrested all the union leaders, put them on trial and put them in jail again. So they crushed it. Mr. Lloyd George, he actually promised the people coming back from war a land of milk and honey and a land fit for heroes. That was his words. That's what he promised to the soldiers and the men and women coming back. He promised them a utopia, and basically what they ended up with was no work, unemployment, or if they got work, cuts in their wages, cuts in their terms and conditions, and by the way, you'll have to work more hours. That's what they came back to. And I go back, and what happened? And why was it all there? Did the working man get anything out of the divvying up of the Arabia and Africa and Europe? No. That went to the privateers and the financiers. And the American bankers made loads of money. And the Swedish arms manufacturers made loads of money. Because they were supplying the dynamite to both sides. They were neutral, Sweden, but they invented sort of dynamite, high explosive, so they sold it to Britain, France, Germany. Who cares? As long as we're making money, we don't care. There was people in Britain made money. People in Britain made millions. Arms manufacturers, arms dealers. But the working class didn't, and right throughout that period, it could go on and on and on. There was actually, I read a letter from a guy, he was an ex-sergeant in the army, and he actually won the Victoria Cross on the Western Front, and he sent a letter into the Herald, basically asking, or stating that after everything he had done, he's come back, he has no job, he gets no money, he can't feed his children. Why? And basically what he goes on to say, he said, I do hope that in the future, if this ever happens again, and you need us to fight for you, that we will not be there. That unfortunately the war doesn't happen again. So people came back, they had nothing. Even fighting for it, they had nothing. And right through the 20s. We're almost there again now. We're still asking for a living wage. We're still asking for better terms and conditions. We're still asking for our unions to have rights. And it's nothing's changing. There you go, I've said enough. Well then, questions or anything more?